Aloha class. This is a lesson about Indian music. Of course, I mean the music of the nation of India, not to be confused with the American Indian culture. And this is the ancient and the modern, India at the crossroads. There was a textbook we've used on the on-campus course that described a certain city as a very modern city, concrete, glass, modern transportation, but at the same time had a very ancient underpinning to the culture, the food, the dress, the music, and so that's the idea I want to convey here: ancient and modern in coexistence and in juxtaposition. So India in the 21st century being at very much at the crossroads in the geopolitical climate. And of course we can learn some things about that by examining the music and the other artistic expressions of the culture. First concept we want to talk about is that there are certain areas of the world, certain geocultural areas, that we could consider to be cradles of contemporary culture. First of all, we can talk about the Middle East, or some people refer to that as West Asia, and North Africa, Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, Palestine, that area there. And we know from biblical accounts that there was a lot of ancient history there. We know about the Tower of Babel. We know about the dispersion of the people after the flood. And here we have one of the cradles of culture from which many other cultures sprang. China and the Han people of China would represent another cradle of culture. Culture has been in existence for millennia. And you can compare that to other cultures that have been established as specific cultures more recently than that. When we talked about the cultures of Polynesia, some of the best guesses are that some of the West Polynesian cultures might be several millennia old, but Marquesas, Hawaii, Tahiti, somewhere in the first millennium, somewhere around 600, 800 AD. And so these cultures we're discussing today have been established much more, or much longer than that, I should say. Central Asia, the area around the Caucasus Mountains, and in fact, the Indo-European language groups, the idea of the Caucasian people, come from that Central Asia origin. And then we have South Asia, which includes India, modern-day Pakistan, modern-day Sri Lanka, and perhaps even include Bangladesh and several of the other nations in that region as cradles of culture, been established for 3 or 4 millennia. So let's discuss today India as a cradle of culture. And again, all of this is just background that helps us to understand the musical combinations and permutations here in India. So we have a major cultural influx, number one, an Aryan migration from Central Asia between 2000 to 1000 BC. And that word Aryan is a word you might have encountered in different contexts. The unfortunate underpinnings of Nazism and Hitler's era. That dark era of 20th century history has to do with a concept of the Aryan race and Aryan supremacy. And we still have neo-Nazi groups, unfortunately, operating today under that guise of Aryan supremacy. So this is a Northern European kind of geocultural connection, and there was an influx of that culture into South Asia from Central Asia. Our major cultural influx number two was due to the Islamic conquest and the trade that occurred along was sometimes known as Silk Road or the spice routes from 1200 AD. And then, of course, more recently we have British colonization from about 1600 AD, and that colonization, that control, that colonial rule by Great Britain lasted until the Second World War. Now, something else that is helpful to know about India is that it's very effectively divided into two sub-geocultural regions, North and South India. There's a geophysical dividing line, the Vindhya mountain range. When we take a look at a map, we'll be able to see a little bit more clearly what that's all about. The South is more ethnically and culturally isolated. So if you can imagine the northern part of India much more accessible to the Islamic people and the traders that traverse that route from the Middle East all the way to East Asia and island Southeast Asia. Those people had very easy access to interact with the people of the North, and since they were a land-traveling people rather than a seafaring people, there wasn't that same kind of connection to the Indian population in the South. We have two language groups that resulted from this division. We have the Hindi language group in the north and the Dravidian language group in the south. We have some religious differences as well. Now, the country as a whole is considered to be a Hindu nation, but the Hinduism that was practiced in the north was influenced by Islam, and some of the ideas about performing arts became influenced by Islam, which we will see. And in the south, we might call it a more orthodox type of Hinduism, less changed, less transformed by Islamic ideas. And we have categories of classical music from both those regions. It's called Hindustani in the north and Karnataka or Carnatic in the south. And this becomes a little confusing to students sometimes because you have the area that is more Orthodox Hindu in the south, and yet you have these terms for the language in the north, Hindi, and the music of the north, Hindustani, and it seems like a disconnect, but that's the way this terminology has transpired, so we have to deal with it. Now let's go right to primary musical elements. And you see a collection of instruments here that kind of gives an idea of what we're dealing with here. You see tabla drums on the left. You see a drone instrument called the tambura next with the young woman in the pink-purple dress. You see the sitar, which is a characteristic melody chordophone of North India, and you see a bamboo flute, which is used in the north and the south. So we have a concept melodically of the raga, and I refer to that as scales plus. Some of the elements of the Western scale in pitches that go up and ascend and descend, but a little bit more in the nuance of these pitch materials than in Western major and minor scales. So think of them as scales plus. Expressive melodic modes, roughly comparable to Western scales, as I said, but implying more about mood and expressiveness. For instance, there are ragas, certain scale patterns that are recognized as being for morning ragas, others for afternoon, others for evening. And a well-versed Indian would recognize if someone was playing a morning raga at night and would recognize that that just wasn't right. You don't have that kind of distinction, of course, in the Western major-minor system. Then we have the tala, the primary rhythmic patterns or rhythmic cycles, and you'll learn more about those. And then we have another element called drone, and a very important part of traditional Indian music. And when you begin to listen to some of the examples from this presentation, you'll hear that characteristic drone. There are other instruments, other cultures that use a drone. For instance, Scottish bagpipes, very familiar sound, and one pipe is used for creating the melody, and other pipes that are protruding from the sag, from the bag of the bagpipes, are tuned to certain pitches that create the drone. Okay, let's take a look at a video demo and you can see what we're talking about here. Now let me tell you what you're going to see here. You're going to see a characteristic melody chordophone of South India called the Veena, or sometimes called the Rudra Veena. You'll see that come up on a slide, so you don't have to worry about the spelling right now. And it sounds a lot like a North Indian sitar that you see in this photo here, but you'll see that it's constructed differently. It's a little bit more homemade, more like a folk instrument less manufactured. Has a long fingerboard or neck, and it has two large gourds that are decorated, and they create sound amplification, intensify the sound. Kind of like the body of an acoustic guitar amplifies the sound of the guitar, sound of the strings. You also see a mridangam drummer. That is the characteristic membranophone of South India. Unlike the tabla drums you see in this photo, it's a single drum with two heads. So very similar sounds to these tabla drums, but both heads are on one barrel drum. And this is a long video, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to listen to the first minute and get an idea of the introduction of this piece, then take the slider over to 4 minutes and check out from 4 minutes to 5 minutes. Get a feel for what the intensity is, the rhythms, the interplay of the drum and the veena, and then take it to 9 minutes and finish it out. So you're basically going to have 3 1-minute segments, beginning, middle, end. And then we can talk about some elements of traditional Indian music. Now there was a drone happening in that particular composition, and you didn't see another player. Sometimes they use an electronic version of the drone now. It's a small box that creates that drone, and sometimes they use a tambura player. Now let's talk about some structural elements of the Karnataka or Carnatic music that you just heard with the Rudraveena and the Mridangam drum. We have the element of melody, solo, or heterophonic combination. That was solo Rudraveena, but sometimes we have heterophonic combinations, especially of voice, chordophones, and flute or aerophone. The rhythm is usually a solo membranophone player, but sometimes multiple instruments, and you'll experience more examples as well. And the drone, as I mentioned, comes sometimes from the tambura, which was the traditional chordophone creating the drone. And when somebody plays an instrument, they don't use their left hand at all. They're not creating any new pitches. They're not doing scale material, raga material. They're just strumming the pre-tuned open strings to create a drone similar to what the drone pipes on the bagpipes create. Sometimes that drone is created by a small keyboard, like a reed organ called the harmonium, and sometimes in the modern times by a digital drone, which is sometimes called a shruti baras. Now let's talk about melodic ornamentation in Indian music. And here's a closer look at a slightly different kind of veena. This one is more manufactured than one you saw in the video, but still have a large gourd for resonance and then a manufactured body for additional resonance. There's a concept in Indian music called shruti, and literally that means that which can be heard, or that which can be discerned by the ears. So the original meaning was there were 22 subdivisions of the octave. Now compare that with piano, keyboard, with the white and black keys, or compare it to a guitar, ukulele fretboard, where you have fret bars placed to create half-step intervals. So if you think of that as 12 half-steps in an octave, and shruti originally meaning 22 subdivisions of the octave, if we think of the 12 subdivisions as half-steps, then you can think of the 22 as being nearly quarter-step size. The contemporary meaning of shruti means microtonal inflection. So the kind of bending of the pitches, the kinds of melodic ornamentation that you hear in Indian singing, and I think many of you have experienced Bollywood movies at this point and heard that kind of very ornamented singing, that those little changes they make in the pitch are shruti ornamentation.